This is one of over 200 talks on the history of Western art, and I've arranged the talks chronologically. I start with cave art and work my way through to art produced in the last few years. So I feel there's something here for everyone, and start where you like. This particular talk is on Joshua Reynolds, and it's part of section 17 on 18th century British art, section 17. He was the first president of the Royal Academy. He dominated British art for 5 decades and was the most important British artist of the 18th century. He was born on the 16th of July 1723 in Plympton, Devon. He was the third son of Reverend Samuel Reynolds, who was a headmaster and clergyman, and he was exposed to classical education and drawing early on in his life, and it shaped his intellectual approach to art, that combination of a classical education and early experience of drawing. In 1740, he was apprenticed to the fashionable London portrait artist Thomas Hudson, and he quickly mastered the conventions of 18th century portraiture, but he grew dissatisfied with its limitations, and that prompted him on his European travels. This particular work was painted when he was 24, and it predates his Italian visit, yet it shows his ambition to align himself with the old masters, particularly artists like Rembrandt, and that you can see in the dramatic chiaroscuro, the introspective gaze, the palette, the earthy browns, the deep shadows. They all mirror the influence of the Dutch Baroque. When he painted this, he was working in Devon and London. He was struggling financially at this stage, and this portrait may have been a promotional piece to demonstrate his skill to potential patrons. He's shielding his eyes, and it seems as though he's looking forward towards a bright future. It's an inventive self-portrait. It was painted just before he left for Italy. He returned from Italy in 1752 and quickly became one of the most famous and fashionable portrait artists of the period, and painted many of the leading figures at the time. Now, Reynolds painted many self-portraits during his long career. I'll only show you a few. This early example was probably, it looks as though it was probably originally vertical, is what I'm trying to say, whereas now it's horizontal format. So we believe that the top and bottom of the painting were hacked off sometime during the 19th century. Its survival is remarkable. Many early works were destroyed or repainted by Reynolds himself as he developed his style. Another early painting, before he left for Italy in 1749, he painted this portrait of William Beale. William Beale was a naval chaplain stationed at Devonport, and he's shown half-length, framed by an oval-shaped stone niche. And Reynolds has slightly enlarged the sitter's features, and that has increased the work's expressive power. But again, an early painting of what was to become a highly successful career. Now, as I said, in his late 20s, he toured Italy, and he was there for some 3 years studying the works, particularly of Michelangelo, Titian and Raphael, and their influence permeated his later work in what was called the grand style. I'll explain more of what that was later, but it blended realism with this idealized grandeur. It was inspired by the old masters. It combined their style with his knowledge of history, literature and mythology to create portraits filled with action, invention, and theatricality. He returned to London in 1753 and very quickly dominated the portrait market because his style appealed to aristocrats, intellectuals, and celebrities. This particular portrait of Captain the Honourable Augustus Keppel, in a way, launched his career as a portrait artist. Keppel was a rising naval hero and a friend of Reynolds. He is depicting him mid-stride on a rocky shore, and it evokes the classical, what's known as contrapposto pose that we see in, for example, this work, the Apollo Belvedere. The stormy skies and windswept hair symbolise maritime challenge and align Keppel with British imperial ambitions during the 7 Years' War. It's probable that the commission arose from Reynolds and Keppel's shared Devon roots, and it was Keppel who secured a passage for Reynolds on a naval vessel that took him to Italy. When it was exhibited in London, it drew a lot of praise for its epic quality, and it distinguished it from the many static contemporary portraits that were seen at the time. Horace Walpole, for example, remarked that it, quote, made every other portrait look like a puppet show. And that sort of response from important critics cemented Reynolds' position in the art world and established him quickly on his return from Italy. This is one of his early portraits. It's a large double portrait, life-size scale, two young aristocrats, Dudley Alexander Sidney Cosby, or Lord Sidney, on the left, and Colonel John Dyke Ackland on the right, leaping forward. They're dressed in a sort of quasi-historical clothing that was invented by Reynolds. And what's happening here is they're mimicking a medieval or Renaissance hunt. And you can see the dead game around them that they leave in their trail, underlining their noble blood and aristocratic right to hunt. And the painting celebrates their friendship, their manly activities, and their mastery of nature. It was painted shortly after Reynolds became president of the Royal Academy in 1768 and started to give the famous discourses on art. They were held almost every year. We know it was painted in August because that was the month Reynolds reserved for his personal projects. And it's likely that his aim with this double portrait was to create a form of art that elevated the art of painting. The picture's large, the composition's tight, and the scene echoes the work of Titian. Incidentally, there was a renewed interest in archery in aristocratic circles at the time because of its ancient, virile and romantic associations. This is Kitty Fisher as Cleopatra dissolving the pearl. Now, Kitty Fisher was a celebrated courtesan, and she was one of the first celebrities to become famous simply for being famous. Reynolds is depicting her here as Cleopatra in a scene recalling the lavish banquet that was held in honour of Mark Antony. And at that banquet, the Egyptian queen, to show her wealth, dissolved a giant pearl in vinegar and then drank it. This theatrical portrait transforms Kitty Fisher from a courtesan into a queen, reflecting the extravagant tale told by Pliny of this dissolving of the pearl, and the work blurs portraiture and history painting. It was a radical approach for depicting a living woman, particularly a courtesan. It was commissioned either by Fisher herself or possibly one of her aristocratic patrons, possibly Lord Sandwich. And it served as both a personal myth-making and social commentary on the what we might call decadence of the 1760s. Reynolds, employed unusual pigments. For example, he mixed ground glass with the oils to get the effect of the pearl in the painting. Now, it was contentious. Contemporary critics, some thought the work was immoral. Some thought it was a masterpiece. Dr. Johnson reportedly called it both splendid and impudent. And the reason it was so shocking was, first of all, the reputation of Kitty Fisher, and to paint her at all gave her a form of public legitimacy that some regarded as shocking and morally scandalous, but then to elevate her to the status of a queen compounded the shock. And Cleopatra herself, of course, was also an emblem of sexual allure and female power. So it's an interesting combination. Fisher's knowing expression and the dissolving pearl, symbolizing transient wealth, creates this moral ambiguity. And the portrait created a trend for these allegorical depictions of actresses and courtesans, and there was a smaller version reportedly painted in just 4 hours to meet demand for reproductions. This is another portrait. This is Nellie O'Brien, a celebrated beauty, possibly a courtesan, again showing Reynolds' ability to blend sensuality and refinement. The sitter's pose is relaxed. She is looking directly out at us, which was unconventional for women's portraits at the time. And it was painted during Reynolds' peak London years, the 1760s, when his studio at Leicester Fields attracted many, many fashionable sitters. O'Brien was one of his favourite models, and she appears in at least 4 of his portraits. It has a warm palette, soft brushwork. It shows, I think, Rembrandt's influence, particularly in the fur-trimmed jacket. The carnation at her bosom symbolises love. Contemporary gossip claimed O'Brien was mistress to Lord Bolingbroke, although Reynolds here presents her with dignified simplicity. One art historian describes how it negotiates the boundary between respectability and allure. Again, Reynolds is pushing the limits of the acceptable, painting women who flouted polite social codes. This is Mrs. Abington as Miss Prue in Love for Love by William Congreve. Now, Frances or Fanny Abington was a leading actress, known for her wit. She was clever and not theatrical. She is shown here as Miss Prue, a character in a Restoration bawdy comedy, Love for Love, by William Congreve. Now, in the play, Miss Prue is a naive and flirtatious country girl who's seduced by a predatory, half-witted dandy. So here, she's adopting what could be seen and was seen as a suggestive or at least unrefined pose, unthinkable for a lady. So it's a work that is both a portrait of unusual directness and candour, her thumb coyly hovering on the lower lip, and at this time it was a gesture like visual shorthand for sexual availability, and it's playing on the mock innocence of a child as the gesture flirts with erotic suggestions while just remaining within the bounds of social acceptability, particularly for an actress, particularly an actress in character. Now, the actress was born Frances Burton. She was the daughter of a private soldier. She grew up in the slums around Drury Lane. She started life, working life as a flower girl, known as Nosegay Fan, a street singer. She became later one of the leading actresses of her day. She had an unhappy marriage to her music teacher, James Abington, and she was called back to the stage by David Garrick, and she remained a well-known, a famous actress for 18 years, noted for having, quotes, not the least tincture of the theatrical. Before becoming an actress, she learned French and French fashion. She later worked in a brothel. She was witty and clever, and she won a distinguished position in society. Women of fashion copied her clothing. And Joshua Reynolds, of course, has made this calculated decision to associate his art with the demi-monde of women who moved among the social elite of society, but whose sex lives flouted political codes of behaviour. The Strawberry Girl. Reynolds, in fact, considered this one of his most original works. He called it one of the half-dozen original things that he had produced. And what he's done is transformed a street vendor into a poetic figure, and he's blurring genres and portrait. The subject was a London working-class girl. Reynolds has idealised her with Raphael-esque beauty. The little girl is selling strawberries. She has a wistful expression suggesting romantic melancholy. It was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1777. And it puzzled critics who were accustomed to Reynolds' grand portraits. Many admired its freshness. Some found it inappropriately sentimental for high art. Loose brushwork, a warm palette shows Reynolds experimenting with techniques he'd learnt from Rubens. The girl's sleeves are rendered with particular virtuosity, balancing realism and aestheticism. It led to numerous copies, although Reynolds insisted that none captured the original expression of simplicity and innocence as he described it. Count Ugolino and his children in the dungeon. Count Ugolino was a political figure in 13th century Pisa. He became involved in the rivalry between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. He was imprisoned with his sons and grandchildren, and they were all left to die of starvation. The story was popularised by Dante's fictionalised encounter with the politician that is described in his Divine Comedy. Now, Reynolds created this for the Royal Academy exhibition of 1773, and it was his most ambitious history painting to date. His friend Edmund Burke praised its sublime terror, although some critics found the subject matter too gruesome. So it had a mixed reception, reflecting the debates at the time about what were the limits of acceptable emotion in art. We know from technical analysis that Reynolds made numerous changes. He included those more visible prism bars in the background, which he later softened to focus on the figures. Three ladies adorning a term of Hymen. The ladies are shown left to right. Barbara, who's preparing for marriage, Elizabeth in the centre, who's engaged, and Anne on the right, who's married. They were the daughters of a rich landowner with estates in Ireland who lived in Scotland, and this painting was commissioned by the fiancée of Elizabeth, the woman in the middle. The composition was inspired in some ways by this engraving called Slumbering Silenus, tied up with tendrils, by Francesco Romanelli, which Reynolds had used as a sort of source for the group portrait. It's a painting in what was called the grand manner. Now, this is an English term widely used in the 18th century to describe what was considered to be the highest style of art in academic theory, a style based on an idealized classical approach. So what he's done is he's painted a portrait of the three ladies, but he's idealized the portrait, he's idealized their faces, although it still remains a portrait, and he's introduced this classical element to combine the portrait with a history painting of a mythological scene. Reynolds used this term grand manner in his discourses, those lectures I mentioned, the 15 lectures he delivered to students at the Royal Academy between 1769, the year after it was founded, and 1790. And in those lectures, Reynolds argued that artists shouldn't paint slavish copies of nature, but should seek a generalized and ideal form that gives what he described as the grand style to invention, to composition, to expression, and even to colouring and drapery. That's a quote from his fourth discourse. In practice, it meant drawing on the style of ancient Greek and Roman, that is classical art, and combining it with the Italian Renaissance masters such as Raphael. The grand manner was strictly used for history painting, but Reynolds adapted it very successfully to portraiture, as we see here, inventing this sort of high art portrait. Right, this isn't by Reynolds, this is by Nathaniel Hone, the elder. A very well-known artist at the time is Angelica Kauffman, and I've given a separate talk on Kauffman. She was a good friend of Reynolds, and their relationship set tongues wagging in society. And this painting by Nathaniel Hone makes fun of the relationship, as it created one of the great art scandals of 18th century British art. Now, Hone had a successful career. He was a fashionable portrait painter. He also painted subject paintings. And the full title of this is The Pictorial Conjurer, displaying the whole art of optical deception. And when it was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1775, it caused an outcry. And the reason was it included a nude caricature of Angelica Kauffman, which was subsequently painted over, this picture I'm showing you is where it's been painted over, but the original can still be seen in a sketch in Tate Britain that was painted by Nathaniel Hone. This is the sketch. Look in the background, top left, behind the wall of prints and drawings. I've got an enlargement which I've placed alongside the later version that he painted over. So the one on the left is the original, the one on the right is his repainting of it to try and minimize the scandal. And you can see on the left, Angelica Kaufmann is the one with the boots, pointing her maul stick at St. Paul's Cathedral. The true offence, though, of this painting, regarded by many as an attack on Kaufmann's friend, Joshua Reynolds, then, of course, president of the Royal Academy. And Joshua Reynolds was well known and sort of freely drew upon the work and poses of the old masters to ennoble his paintings. But some artists, like Hone, saw this as plagiarism, saw him as not just borrowing from or inspired by, but as copying the work of the old masters. And that's what Hone is attacking here, Reynolds' plagiarism as Hone saw it. And he's presenting Reynolds as a conjurer, someone who magics up pictures by copying them from the old masters. And what you can see in the background are prints of the old masters' work, which Reynolds, in the form of the conjurer, is copying from. He's actually holding in his hand one of Raphael's works, Diadem Madonna. And the subject is Truth is Revealed to Man, a Hone's sort of comment on Reynolds' artistic practices. The young girl leaning on Reynolds' knee is intended, and many saw it, as Kaufmann. But it was the naked woman in the background that incensed many people. The reason that she's pointing to St. Paul's is that Kaufmann and Reynolds were together working on a project to decorate St. Paul's Cathedral at the time. So after a brief showing at the Academy, it was requested the painting be removed. It was removed. Hone was furious and withdrew his works from the Royal Academy, and he organised an independent display of his work, which in fact was the first one-man show ever held in the British Isles. Now, this was painted in 1780, but I'm showing it to reference the fact that Reynolds was elected as the first president of the Royal Academy in the year the Academy was founded, 1768. And it cemented his authority. He was already a well-known artist, as I said. And then as president of the Royal Academy, he gave discourses on art, which established a sort of foundation for what was regarded as the greatest form of academic art in Britain. It was a sort of foundational text for academic art theory. And his intention was to raise the status of British art and British artists from what he regarded as a tradesman's craft to an admired scholarly profession. He was knighted by George III, and he became principal painter to the king upon the death of Ramsay in 1784. But in fact, Reynolds was never asked to paint anything by the king. The bust next to him is Michelangelo. It's alongside volumes of Raphael and Titian's work. The red academic robes he's wearing affirm his official role. And this is a sort of visual testament, a legacy emphasizing his commitment to elevating art for the whole nation through education and classical ideals. It was exhibited in 1789. It was seen as a valedictory image because Reynolds died some 3 years later. And so you could see this as a testament to his artistic work. He worked on it intermittently for about 2 years. He repeatedly scraped it down and repainted areas. And at this stage, towards the end of his life, his vision was worsening every month. He owned the bust of Michelangelo. It's based on a bust by Daniele da Valterra. And his admiration of Michelangelo is demonstrated by his final words of his final discourse, when he said, quote, "I should desire that the last words which I should pronounce in this academy and from this place might be the name of Michelangelo." We're moving towards the end of his life. This is Simon and Iphigenia in the Royal Collection, thanks to George IV. As I said, George III knighted Reynolds, but never asked him to paint anything. But George IV commissioned portraits at the end of the artist's life and acquired many examples of his early work. And this painting is an important history painting dating from his final years. It was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1789 and is therefore one of his last works. It was bequeathed by Reynolds to his niece, Mary Palmer, who was Marchioness of Thomond, and she presented it to George IV in 1814. She was the eldest daughter of Reynolds' sister, often referred to as Reynolds' favourite niece, and she became his primary heir upon his death and inherited this painting. And she was the one who preserved his legacy and promoted his work extensively after his death. The subject here, you might be wondering what this is about. It's from Giovanni Boccaccio's 14th century collection of stories, the Decameron. Now, Simon was an oafish son of a Cyprian noble, confined by his father to his country estates, and then one day while out wandering on the estate, he came upon Iphigenia asleep by a stream and was instantly struck by her beauty, and the love thus kindled had the power to transform Simon from a country bumpkin to an elegant courtier, and that enabled him to win Iphigenia's hand in marriage. The figure of Iphigenia is inspired by the Venetian tradition of the female nude, particularly works of Titian such as Venus of Urbino and Venus del Pardo. Well-known monumental portrait depicting Omai, a Polynesian visitor brought to England by Captain Cook. It's a blend of ethnographic detail with classical idealism. Mai is what was known at the time as a noble savage. It was commissioned by Joseph Banks, the naturalist on Cook's voyage, and the portrait reflects the Enlightenment fascination with other cultures. Incidentally, the term savage at the time was a respectful term because the people of other cultures were often seen to be in a more pure and noble state. And the people, for example, of Britain were seen to be corrupt by civilization. So the pose, which here he's wearing a Roman toga, offsetting his Tahitian tattoos, is a visual metaphor for this cultural intersection of the pure and the ancient cultures of the ancient world. It was exhibited in 1776. It caused a sensation. It appealed to British imperial pride, although many found this combination unsettling. And the painting's later history reflects changing attitudes. It was celebrated in the 18th century, then it was neglected, forgotten in the 19th century, and now, of course, it's reevaluated as a complex colonial document, as one art historian put it, both a celebration and containment of cultural difference. His expression may reflect melancholy, homesickness. He returned to Tahiti but died young, adding poignancy to the image. This is Mrs. Siddons as the Tragic Muse. He painted it in 1784. He wasn't creating just a portrait. He was elevating celebrity into allegory, transforming a living performer into something near divine. Now, Mrs. Siddons was renowned for her intense, emotionally charged performances. One of her famous roles was Lady Macbeth, and she sat for Reynolds in this consciously theatrical pose, draped in sumptuous robes, framed by shadowy personifications of terror and pity. But this wasn't just a costume drama, it was a masterclass in 18th century image making. Reynolds, ever the intellectual, is drawing on classical and Renaissance sources for the composition. He's clearly referencing Michelangelo and Raphael in the monumental scale, the sculptural form of the sitter. But whereas the old masters drew from myth, Reynolds has Siddons, a very modern, well-known celebrity, and that was entirely the point. In fact, when he'd finished the painting, he's said to have bowed gallantly and declared, quote, "I have succeeded in painting the tragic muse, and now I leave her." And in fact, he signed his name not on the canvas, but on the hem of her gown, a theatrical flourish worthy, I think, of the subject. She, at the time, was at the height of her fame. She was praised for bringing new emotional depth to tragic roles. And Reynolds, ever attuned to the cultural moment, using her to assert the dignity and power of drama, and perhaps, by extension, of painting itself. It's a tribute to not just one woman, but art's capacity to enshrine genius. It's now in the Dulwich Picture Gallery, its impact undiminished, a secular icon of theatrical pathos and artistic ambition. The Age of Innocence, painted, we think, around 1788, it depicts childhood sentimentally. It became one of his most reproduced works, which is why I'm showing it. The title was actually added posthumously, reflecting romantic ideals about childhood purity. We don't know who the subject is. Possibly it's Lady Anne Spencer's daughter. It may have been a model. Simple white dress, pastoral setting. It's rejecting our aristocratic pretensions to create this universal appeal. He's using a sort of soft focus technique that he learned from 17th century Dutch masters to create this dreamlike quality. Slightly flushed cheeks, loose hair. These were radical naturalistic touches for the period. It was extremely popular. It led to countless copies and countless prints. It became one of Reynolds' most widely recognised works by the early 19th century. Ruskin, later in the 19th century, criticised it as overtly saccharine, but it remained beloved by the public. Technical analysis shows that he made significant changes during painting. Originally, there was a lamb, a symbol of innocence, that he later painted out. And portraits of children became an increasingly important part of Reynolds' artistic practice in the 1770s and onwards. The latter decades of the 18th century saw a preoccupation with notions of childhood, influenced partly by the work of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He argued for the inherent innocence, not just of what he called primitive people, but of children as well. And this helped to establish what you could call a cult of childhood across Europe, whereas previously children weren't recognized as anything special, maybe as young adults. But this preoccupation with the innocence of childhood, this newfound idea of innocence described by Rousseau, created this cult of childhood. And it found visual expression in the work of British artists, particularly Reynolds. This is a late mythological work, painted when Reynolds was nearly blind, symbolising Britain's emerging imperial power. It's called The Infant Hercules Strangling Serpents in His Cradle. Hercules here represents Britain, and the serpents are Britain's enemies. It was commissioned by Catherine the Great of Russia, and it was part of a diplomatic gift exchange. The political allegory was timely. It was painted during the Nootka Sound crisis, when Britain faced multiple European rivals. Because of his deteriorating eyesight, he used broader brushstrokes and a more expressive style. The work's reception was mixed. Some admired its vigour, others found it crude compared with his earlier refined work, and it is significant, I think, as Reynolds' last major history painting. And Catherine the Great of Russia reportedly displayed it alongside works by Rubens and Rembrandt, a high honour that pleased the aged Reynolds. This is the last work I'll be showing you, showing the aging Reynolds, a self-portrait, 1788. Reynolds never married. He was known to be very sociable, charming. He was often surrounded by women from fashionable society. He had many friendships with women, including Angelica Kauffman, but there's no conclusive documented evidence of any romantic entanglement. He was devoted to his sister Frances, who kept house for him, and his professional ambitions and hard work appear to have taken precedent over any personal attachments. He became one of the most successful artists of the 18th century. He painted at least 27 self-portraits over his career, and this was his penultimate self-portrait, painted when he was around 65. It was a popular work. There were numerous versions and copies that survive to the present day. It was described at the time as, quotes, extremely like him, and exhibits him exactly as he appeared in his latter days in domestic life, end quote. Unlike his earlier self-portraits, he now wears a powdered wig, perhaps to conceal his thinning hair, and towards the end of his life, his sight and hearing deteriorated dramatically. He had a hearing impediment most of his life from a chill that he caught when he visited Italy, and he always carried an ear trumpet with him. But towards the end of his life, his hearing deteriorated further, and in 1789 he stopped painting entirely. He died when he was 68, possibly a liver ailment. He's buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, a mark of his intense respect he commanded in British society. He was a central figure in 18th century British art and intellectual circles that he mixed with. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new era with artists like J.M.W. Turner and John Constable, who were championing the new romantic style. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you will join me again soon on another adventure through Western art. Goodbye for now.